our God, will you not judge them? For we are powerless before this great multitude who are coming against us, nor do we know what to do, but our eyes are on you. Our eyes are on you. Our eyes. I want you, before you take your seat, I want you to touch somebody and tell them, keep your eyes on God. That's what I want to talk about right now. Keep your eyes on the Lord. Amen. Now let me tell you about some things particularly relevant, and I'm going to be out of your way in just a few minutes because I talked a while this morning. But let me talk about something that I think is important for us to consider. Now, you may not be aware of this from a technical point of view or the standard of technology as it relates to how things unfold, but there is what we call a crisis theology or a Christ-centered bibliography. And that is to suggest that there is a crisis way in which we operate our theological understanding, which is theology, the study of I was studying this week with some of my fellow colleagues on an intensive, and in dealing with that intensive, we come to understand that Emil Brunner as well as Karl Barth were opposite of each other, but they were both Swiss immigrants that ended up in Germany during the time of Stalin and during the time of Hitler. It's important for you to understand that during that period where they were exterminating the Jews, and there was what we call genocide of the Jews, where they were doing all kinds of things, and in different places in Germany, Dachau in particular, where you see the bones of all of these Jewish immigrants, how that they were killing them and piling their bones up, and they look like mountains because they were trying to get rid of them because they had on them the favor of God. Because they had on them the favor of God, Hitler thought it was important for him to annihilate them because he saw himself in such a narcissistic way. How could God prefer anybody over him? And if that be the case, eradicate, wipe out, and destroy everything and everybody that God cared about. And so it's interesting to see how that it unfolds within the understanding of the theology of God or the study of God, how that there comes a time when you have got to figure out your crisis theology, the stuff that gets you through, not when things are bad, not when situations are in your favor, not when everything is going your way, not when everybody is patting you on your back and telling you how wonderful and how awesome and how great you are. But you need an understanding of God that will not shake your faith when things fall apart all around you. In other words, we're constantly being beaten at and hit at about how we trust God. Why you trust in God and you steadily sick, trusting God and you're steadily dying, trusting God and you don't have money to feed yourself, and you're trusting God and you're doing everything that you know to do. And so you have to develop an understanding of a crisis theology that will give you a sense of how to understand and know God when you're in your worst moment of your life. And if you don't understand a crisis theology, if you don't understand how to deal with a God that you can't see, that's why Job utters out of his exasperation, out of his pain, out of his his life, all that I knew, I can't find him. I go forward and he's not there, and backward, and I cannot perceive him. For he hideth himself, that I may not know him. On the left hand where he doth work, I shall behold him. For he then knoweth the way that I take, and when he hath tried me. It is the devil's intentions to block out the God view in your life, to tell you that God doesn't exist. That's why you're about to go through what you're going through. That if God loved you, he wouldn't allow certain things to happen to you. If God cared about you, then he would not let you be always on the losing end. And that does not weigh in as it relates to how you treat God. And it's always, have you ever been in a one-sided relationship? And that one-sided relationship is always developed on one person's behalf and not the other. Sometimes we do God like that. We think God ought to be the giver all the time. God ought to come through all the time. God ought to help us all the time. God ought to make a way for us all the time. And we have no response. We don't do things to get his approval by doing some of the stuff that he wants us to do. If you love me, he said, feed my sheep. There comes a point where it has to be reciprocal. That relationship is not one. You can't always be in a relationship with somebody and then every time you turn around, you're always demanding that person to make all of the sacrifices and you make none of the sacrifices. That is an unfair, unbalanced, unequitable relationship. It's nobody that can have a relationship and you're always on